They called her the Widowmaker. Not officially, not in any naval document or shipyard record, but among the men who served aboard her and the families who waited for them to come home, the name stuck. K-19 was a Soviet hotel-class ballistic missile submarine, one of the most powerful weapons ever built, and she carried a reputation that preceded her long before the world ever learned why. The men who volunteered for her crew knew they were accepting something beyond the normal risks of submarine service. They knew the ship had problems. They knew the Soviet Navy pushed her harder than any submarine should be pushed, and they went anyway, because that's what submariners did. Soviet submarine crews operated under a different philosophy than their American counterparts, where the Americans emphasized caution, redundancy, and meticulous safety procedures. The Soviets prioritized speed, capability, and results. If a system wasn't working perfectly, you worked around it. If a deadline couldn't be met safely, you found a way to meet it anyway. The pressure came from the top, from admirals who answered to political leaders who needed to demonstrate that the Soviet Union could match America's nuclear capabilities. The men at the bottom of that chain, the sailors and officers aboard submarines like K-19, absorbed the consequences. K-19 was commissioned in 1960, part of a crash program to put ballistic missile submarines at sea as quickly as possible. The Hotel class was designed to carry 3 R-11 FM missiles, each capable of delivering a nuclear warhead to a target on the American mainland. These submarines were a critical component of Soviet nuclear deterrence strategy. If the United States launched a first strike, Hotel-class submarines operating in the Atlantic could retaliate. That capability mattered enormously to Soviet strategic planners, which meant the submarines had to be operational, had to be at sea, had to be ready. K-19's captain understood the weight of that responsibility. Captain Vostrikov was a driven officer, the kind of man the Soviet Navy promoted precisely because he got results. He pushed his crew, pushed his ship, demanded performance that matched the political expectations coming down from Moscow. His crew respected him in the way Soviet submarine crews respected capable commanders. Not always with warmth, but with the knowledge that a competent captain kept you alive. Vostrikov knew his submarine. He knew her strengths and he knew her problems. And he spent his career trying to keep the problems from becoming disasters. The men aboard K-19 were professionals. Soviet submarine sailors underwent rigorous training, learned their systems, qualified for their positions through examinations that demanded genuine mastery. They lived in the same cramped compartments as their American counterparts, ate similar institutional meals, stood the same rotating watches. The submarine was their world for weeks at a time. They learned its sounds, its rhythms, its personality. Every submarine has one, a combination of mechanical noises, vibrations, and subtle environmental cues that experienced crews read instinctively. K-19's crew knew theirs intimately, but there was something else aboard K-19 that the crew carried with them, something that went beyond professional duty. The Soviet submarine program had suffered losses. Accidents happened. Men didn't always come home. The families of submarine sailors in the Soviet Union lived with that uncertainty quietly, because the nature of submarine operations meant that information about accidents was classified, sometimes permanently. A wife might know her husband was at sea, but have no way of knowing if something had gone wrong until weeks or months later, if she learned at all. The men aboard K-19 understood this. They understood that the ocean didn't distinguish between American and Soviet submarines when it came to the physics of pressure and failure. The mission that would define K-19's history was a patrol into the North Atlantic, specifically into waters near the Arctic, where the submarine could position her missiles within range of targets in the American Northeast. This wasn't an unusual mission for a Hotel-class submarine. It was exactly what the class was designed to do. Exactly why the Soviet Navy had rushed these submarines into service. K-19 would transit to her patrol area, maintain position, and demonstrate Soviet capability to strike American cities with nuclear weapons. A routine strategic deterrence patrol. The crew prepared K-19 for departure with a thoroughness that submarine operations demanded. Systems were checked, supplies loaded, weapons verified. The reactor plant was inspected and certified for the coming patrol. Everything looked correct on paper. Everything passed inspection. The submarine was ready to sail, and in the summer of 1961, she did exactly that, heading out into the North Atlantic with her crew and her missiles and the weight of Soviet strategic expectations on her steel hull. The first days of patrol proceeded normally. K-19 transited to her designated operating area, conducted the checks and maneuvers that patrol operations required, and maintained the silence that ballistic missile submarines depended on. Detection by American forces would compromise the entire mission, so the crew operated with extreme care, minimizing noise, avoiding shipping lanes, running systems at levels designed to keep the submarine acoustically invisible. It was tedious, careful work, the kind of sustained vigilance that submarine crews practiced constantly. And then something went wrong with the reactor. The Soviet naval reactor aboard K-19 used a pressurized water design, similar in principle to American submarine reactors, but built to different specifications, maintained to different standards, and operated with less redundancy than its American equivalents. The primary coolant system, the loop that carried heat from the reactor core to the steam generators, developed a leak. Coolant began escaping from the system, and the reactor temperature started rising. This was serious. Reactor coolant loss could lead to core damage if not addressed quickly. The cooling water kept the reactor core from overheating, and without sufficient coolant, the fuel elements would begin to deteriorate. In a shore-based facility, the response would be straightforward. Shut the reactor down, repair the leak, restore coolant levels. Aboard a submarine at sea, hundreds of miles from any port, the options were far more limited. Vostrikov faced a decision that no submarine commander ever wants to face. The reactor was losing coolant. The temperature was climbing. The submarine needed to surface to address the problem. But surfacing a ballistic missile submarine in waters where American forces might be operating would reveal Soviet position and capability. It was a choice between operational security and the safety of his crew and ship. Vostrikov chose his crew. K-19 surfaced. The reactor was shut down. Now came the harder problem. The submarine had no backup propulsion system capable of moving her at any meaningful speed. She was essentially dead in the water, drifting, unable to dive, unable to flee, dependent entirely on the repairs her crew could make to the reactor plant. And those repairs had to be made quickly, because a reactor without coolant wasn't just a broken machine. It was a potential source of lethal radiation, and it was getting worse by the hour. Vostrikov assembled a team of men to work on the reactor coolant system. These weren't specialists in nuclear engineering. They were submarine sailors, trained in reactor operations, but not in the kind of emergency repair work that the situation demanded. The reactor compartment was already showing elevated radiation levels. Every minute spent inside exposed the men to doses that would have consequences, sometimes immediate, sometimes lingering over years. The men knew this. They went in anyway. The work was brutal. The men worked in shifts, entering the reactor compartment to attempt repairs on the coolant system while radiation levels climbed. There was no dosimetry equipment adequate to the situation. The men couldn't know exactly how much radiation they were absorbing. They could feel the effects beginning: nausea, weakness, the first signs of radiation sickness. But they kept working because the alternative was worse. If the reactor coolant system couldn't be repaired, if the core continued to deteriorate, the situation could become catastrophic, not just for the crew, but for the surrounding ocean and any ships or aircraft operating in the area. Soviet submarine crews operated with a sense of duty that went beyond professional obligation. These were men who had been raised in a system that demanded sacrifice for the collective, who had been told their entire lives that the mission came first, that individual welfare was secondary to the needs of the state and the defense of the homeland. Aboard K-19, that ideology met reality in the most brutal possible way. The men who entered that reactor compartment were sacrificing themselves knowingly for the safety of their shipmates and their submarine. They did it without hesitation, without dramatic speeches, without the kind of heroic moments that make good stories. They did it because someone had to, and they were the ones there. The repairs eventually achieved a partial fix, enough to restore some coolant flow and stabilize the reactor situation. But the damage to the men who had worked inside the compartment was already done. Radiation sickness doesn't announce itself immediately in its worst form. The men felt ill. Some felt very ill. But the full extent of what the radiation had done to their bodies would become apparent over days, then weeks, then months. K-19 limped toward the nearest Soviet naval facility. Vostrikov made contact with Soviet Naval Command, requesting assistance. The response was complicated by the political sensitivity of the situation. A ballistic missile submarine with a reactor accident, potentially contaminated, requesting help in waters where American forces might detect the communications. Soviet command had to balance the need to rescue the crew against the need to keep the incident classified. The delay in sending assistance would cost lives. When Soviet rescue ships finally arrived, the crew was transferred. The men who had worked on the reactor repairs were among the first evacuated. They were taken to naval hospitals where Soviet doctors attempted to treat their radiation injuries. Some of the men recovered, others did not. The radiation doses they had absorbed were, in many cases, lethal, though death from acute radiation sickness doesn't always come quickly. Some men died within days, others lingered for weeks. A few survived initially, but suffered the long-term consequences of severe radiation exposure for the rest of their shortened lives. The total death toll from K-19's reactor accident would eventually reach somewhere around 20 men, though the exact number remains disputed because Soviet record-keeping was inconsistent and some deaths were attributed to other causes to maintain the secrecy of the incident. 20 men dead from an accident that the Soviet Union officially denied for decades. 20 families that received no official explanation for why their sons or husbands or fathers never came home or were told vague stories about illness or other causes that didn't match the reality. Vostrikov survived. He was not punished for surfacing the submarine, though in the Soviet Navy, commanders who revealed sensitive operations to the enemy sometimes faced severe consequences. His decision to prioritize his crew's survival over operational security was ultimately recognized as the correct one, though recognition in the Soviet system didn't always translate into reward. He continued to serve, carrying the weight of what had happened aboard K-19 for the rest of his career. K-19 herself was repaired. The Soviet Navy didn't simply decommission a submarine that had cost so much to build and equip. She was returned to service, her reactor compartment decontaminated and repaired, her systems restored to operational status. She would have further accidents in her service life, further incidents that reinforced her reputation as the Widowmaker. The submarine that had been pushed too hard, maintained to standards that were insufficient, operated in a system that valued capability over safety, would continue to demonstrate exactly why those priorities were dangerous. The Soviet Union maintained secrecy around K-19's accident for decades. The men who served aboard her were discouraged from discussing what had happened. Some were explicitly warned that talking about the incident could have consequences. The families of the dead received no official acknowledgement that their loss had occurred during a nuclear submarine accident. It wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Union that the full story began to emerge, as former crew members spoke publicly and declassified documents confirmed what rumors had suggested for years. The contrast with the American response to submarine accidents is striking. When USS Thresher was lost in 1963, 2 years after K-19's incident, the United States Navy conducted a thorough public investigation, published detailed findings, and implemented sweeping safety reforms. The SubSafe program that emerged from Thresher's loss fundamentally changed how American submarines were built and maintained. The Soviet response to K-19 was the opposite: silence, denial, and continued operation of submarines to the same demanding standards that had caused the accident in the first place. This isn't to suggest that the Soviet submarine force was reckless or incompetent. Soviet submarine sailors were skilled, brave, and dedicated professionals who operated their vessels in the same hostile ocean environment as their American counterparts. But the system they operated within made different choices about the balance between capability and safety, and those choices had consequences measured in lives. K-19's crew paid one of those prices, and for decades, they paid it in silence. The story of K-19 eventually reached a wider audience when it became the subject of a Hollywood film in 2002, though the film took considerable creative liberties with the historical record. Harrison Ford portrayed a composite commander character, and the narrative was dramatized significantly to fit the requirements of feature filmmaking. The real story doesn't need dramatization. It's compelling enough on its own. Men who knew the risks, who went to sea anyway, who faced a crisis that the system they served had helped create, and who sacrificed themselves to save their shipmates without anyone outside the Soviet Navy knowing it had happened. The lessons from K-19 mirror those from Thresher in many ways. Complex systems fail. When they fail in hostile environments, the consequences can be catastrophic. The men who operate those systems deserve equipment that meets safety standards worthy of their service. They deserve maintenance procedures that catch problems before they become emergencies. They deserve a command structure that values their lives alongside the operational requirements it must meet. K-19's crew deserved all of these things, and in 1961, the Soviet system couldn't deliver them. Today, the submarine forces of every nation that operates nuclear submarines have incorporated lessons from accidents like K-19 and Thresher. Reactor designs are more robust. Maintenance standards are more rigorous. Emergency procedures are more comprehensive. The culture aboard submarine has shifted towards safety without sacrificing capability. These changes came at a cost, paid by men like K-19's crew. Men whose sacrifice wasn't publicly honored for decades, but whose experience shaped how submarines are built and operated to this day. K-19 was eventually decommissioned and scrapped, her reputation following her to the end. The Widowmaker designation was earned through blood and suffering, through the deaths of men who entered a contaminated reactor compartment, knowing what it would cost them. They did it because the alternative was worse, because the submarine and everything she carried mattered, because that's what their duty demanded. The Soviet Navy learned from K-19, eventually, in the same incremental way that every submarine service learns from its worst days. Slowly, painfully, and at a price that should never have been necessary to pay.